All these papers are coming out. Are LMs really intelligent? And don't really question intelligence. They are just talking about the technicalities of a certain benchmark and completely leave out a lot of other aspects of intelligence. And it's interesting when you look at non-Western views of intelligence, they don't use the same term, or if they do have a similar term, they define it differently. And they bring in the moral, the relational, social, practical aspects of intelligence. It's not just performance on some standardized tests or benchmarks. Welcome, Pathfinders and all wandering wanderers eager to explore paths to better tech futures together. We are Tethic's Firekeepers, Alia Isakovic and Matthew Mitka, inviting you to embrace the lunacy of tech. Each podcast episode is a meandering exploration inspired by the seeds planted in our new newsletter and the paths illuminated during our full moon gathering. To find out more about us and our pathfinding adventure, visit thethics.co/pathfinders. In this episode, we want to explore what sort of intelligence we are actually looking for in our AI tools and companions. In the 1960s, Joseph Weizenbaum developed ELIZA, a rule-based chatbot therapist that kept users talking about themselves by matching keywords from user input to its scripted responses. ELIZA's creator was surprised and shocked to find that people attributed intelligence, understanding, and other human attributes to this fairly simple pattern matching program. Now, nearly 60 years later, we're actually being sold computer software with the promise of intelligence and reasoning. And while technologists again debate whether large language models are actually intelligent or just stochastic parrots, the AI companions they help build are having very real impacts on people's lives, even contributing to suicide. Our complicated human lives are so much more than the intelligence measured in standardized tests. And popular sci-fi depictions of AI companions in TV shows like Star Trek or movies like Her also reveal that our aspirations for machine intelligence often go beyond reasoning. Do we actually need AI or AGI that is super intelligent? Or are we just craving a somebody or a some bot that will make us feel heard and seen, something that the ELIZA chatbot achieved with a far simpler algorithm? And what kind of intelligence are the AI creators and investors actually looking for? In short, the guiding question for today's exploration is, how intelligent do AI companions actually need to be? Welcome back, Matt. How are you doing on this Monday?
Excellent. After a wonderful full moon, I'm feeling good. Wonderful question for us to be exploring. So excited to dive into it.
Yeah, this one is probably going to be even more meandering than usually because there's a lot to unpack and explore, and a lot of little concepts and words we threw in that question that we can play with and dance with. So
Sure
maybe, yeah, let's begin today's exploration by talking about what kind of intelligence did we actually create with these large language models, so LLMs like ChatGPT? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's a great question because even the word intelligence kind of has all this baggage to it. We might kind of think about this as there's things that they do which are dumb, and things that they do which might be smart. And simple things that will, at least humans find simple to do, like count how many R's are in the word strawberry. These machines, these systems don't necessarily have the ability to kind of do something so simple. Yet there's all these, at least mimicking of this brilliance that comes out in some very complex tasks that you might direct them towards. So it's kind of like smart, dumb, but even this word intelligence, like, we've got a picture of Data here from Star Trek, and this kind of references, and we'll dive into that in a bit. But I think, yeah, this idea of intelligence, like, and this is where the kind of acronym, AI is, I don't know, it's a little bit weird. We've had lots of discussions in the past about this. I think we've delved into this in previous full moon gatherings. And so you might also kind of think about, okay, just that acronym itself, like where's it not necessarily fitting for what these things actually do. And I think you've got like the um, acronym salami as an example that was originally coined by an Italian politician. I think it was Stefano Quintarelli, and Timnit Gebru kind of used that as a reference, and that stands for systematic approaches to learning algorithms and machine inferences, right? So, and the joke around that was like, if we go, okay, my salami bot, or salami chatbot, like, if you start using that as a way, do you start thinking about it differently and drawing attention to it? And I think I try and encourage my kids to not use the term AI.
Mm.
I try and encourage them to talk about it as software, like as
Mm.
it's an app, um, rather than trying to project this conceptual idea onto this technology. Um, yeah. So, what type of intelligence have we created? I'm not quite
I
sure,
mean,
but no doubt we're going to get into some of the details of that question.
yeah, and the question, we intentionally picked a question that is a bit provocative, right? Because we
Yeah.
have this term of intelligence that we actually, yeah, have a lot of problems with, as we will explore through this discussion. I'm not sure, and obviously the phrase AI companions as well, which has many different meanings and often kind of implies a more intimate relationship with these programs. And I like that your example that you're trying to get your kids to think about these AI chatbots as software, because that's what they are. And I'm just rewatching Star Trek, and it's so interesting to just observe the character of Mr. Data, because it was created. Obviously, the behavior of Data is in some ways a plot device, a way to create humor,
Mhm.
to reflect on maybe the weird phrases that humans use. So, but again, Data also kind of reflects the weird humanity in similar ways than LLMs. But it's interesting how in a lot of science fiction, not just Star Trek, I'm sure there are many other examples, we were able to imagine this perfect knowledge information retrieval android, but somehow we couldn't imagine that sort of creation having the emotional intelligence. So now watching Star Trek and Mr. Data after we have ChatGPT, it feels kind of jarring, because my experience with ChatGPT is that it's actually better at the emotional, maybe even manipulative aspects of language than factual retrieval. So right now we have this, technology that is prone to hallucination, whereas we were imagining these perfect androids that were basically, perfect search engines or perfect librarians. Maybe that's a better comparison. Although I also started thinking, maybe, who knows, maybe Mr. Data is also hallucinating facts, but because the society, the humans of Star Trek have become so reliant on these technologies and androids, they kind of lost their critical thinking skills, and nobody is fact checking Data
Yeah.
because they
Are
assume.
they verifying the
Yeah,
facts
no,
that's just
now
spat out of Mr. Data?
from our perspective and experience of LLMs, that makes you wonder, right? Although maybe I would assume that Mr. Data is running on a different architecture, not the current transformer architecture of LLMs. So maybe
Hmm.
maybe the knowledge of LLMs was lost, and by the time Star Trek comes comes into place, they have a different architecture, and maybe they intentionally didn't want to make it too manipulative and too, yeah, skilled at the emotional part, the emotional intelligence. So who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting question, right? And how we're almost at this right now uncanny valley of intelligence where you have like so many moments where these programs appear intelligent, but then they trip up with something simple. And we have plenty of interesting examples, like counting R's, although the newer strawberry model can supposedly do that. But even in for instance in voice mode, I was telling you about this, how I keep getting annoyed because ChatGPT keeps pronouncing my name wrong,
That's
and
annoying.
even after, that's so annoying. So it keeps saying alja because that's how it sees it reads it and assumes the English pronunciation. And even though I keep telling it it's Alia, can you please pronounce it Alia? It's, it will get it sometimes right, but then it does things like, oh, apologies, Alja, I'll make sure to pronounce it right. And, obviously that's like when it does that for the 10th time. Um, and
Infuriating. That's infuriating.
yeah, it's like, oh, how can you? And we're otherwise having like a good brainstorming session and a good conversation, and and starting to almost relate to you. And I think we're friends, and now that's almost like a passive aggressive
Yeah.
statement, right? And it's interesting that it's also spelling your name wrong, right? Not saying it wrong, but it also wants
Yeah, that's
to.
right. Despite my persistent efforts to try and clarify that my name is spelt with one T, and when it refers to Matt, it's always bringing it in this additional T. And the assumption that I have around that is that statistically, there's more Matthews with double T than there are with one T, which is an interesting novel example there, because what that represents is the statistical inferences that are being made, these machine inferences that are being made that are just statistics, right? And despite the efforts of myself to correct it, just like with your pronunciation of your name, although pronunciation I guess is sometimes
Yeah, it's
a
different
little
because
bit
it's like
different than the
involves
voice.
text to speech. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's telling, and I guess it's a signal of the architecture behind them, um, where something that would seem so simple, you tell a human, oh yeah, no, I'm Matthew with one T, which I do have to constantly remind people of. Humans will get that. This machine,
Yeah.
something so simple, uh, will not. So those little subtleties are important to pay attention to, because it reveals those invisible realities behind these technologies and the way they're actually designed and architected.
Yeah. But it's interesting that it's, however, very good at empathizing, right? Because when you
Mm,
point out the error, it has limitless amounts of patience, and like it's very apologetic, right? And it will assure you it will get it right. So it's interesting, but at the same time, maybe we shouldn't be surprised because that's Eliza, the simple therapist chat was able to do that. So maybe it's just a script, right?
mm,
And we don't actually need a lot of intelligence to power it and to make it feel like this chatbot, this LLM cares about us because it makes us feel like, I'm sorry, yeah, I acknowledge, like, I recognize my mistake, my bad, I will try to be better in the future. Like, that's a very powerful thing to hear as a human.
yeah,
So yeah,
that's
it's interesting.
yeah. That, like, the idea that well, the basis behind the Turing test and not being able to discern whether it's a human or a machine. It doesn't require, like, this is like, ELIZA's like simple decision trees, or more, complex decision trees and associations between words. But that's, that's really what it takes to actually convince, or, or present these systems as intelligent as humans. And what does that say about us, right? And most of the
Yeah.
interactions that we have, what we're expecting, and maybe how sharp our cognitive abilities are at being able to kind of pick up on smaller cues. Although that's when something is mediated, right? Obviously, in person, in meat space, it's different, right? We're embodied beings. We pick up on lots of nonverbal cues and sense and um, uh, signals that indicate that someone is real. And we're not quite there, like in terms of the robotics, um, being able to mimic humans. Despite the facade and bullshit that was presented by Tesla at their demos, their machines were actually being
Wizard of Oz.
yeah, Wizard of Oz style with people behind them.
Yeah.
So we're quite far off in being able to do that. But this gets to the whole point of like mimicking, and if it's mimicking, then like is that enough? And in this case, yeah, it is enough. Like because even ELIZA back then, that was enough to be able to kind of get people into the relational model of like patient and therapist. Which is interesting in and of itself, the power of language.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, like, even the physical world. I think it's worth remembering that we are basically an animist species, no
Yep.
matter, how now rational we imagine ourselves to be and all of that. We, have a rich history of embodied experience where we see and feel and imagine even inanimate objects having a spirit, right? We have a rich tradition of that. So we're actually very good. And,
Mm.
the fact that we can easily see faces in clouds and different objects. So we are kind of wired to see, a spirit, a soul in even in objects. So I wouldn't even say that, I think once we get like robots become more commonplace, people will have the same situation basically that we did with ELIZA, where people will attribute more intelligence and a soul to these robots, regardless of how complicated and sophisticated the algorithm that is running them is, right?
Mm.
So that's something to be aware of. And it's, I think, this gap between technologists like Joseph Weizenbaum, who insisted ELIZA is dumb, right? It's just like a
Yes.
script. It's just an experiment to see, what's possible, but it's like not intelligence. And the lived experiences of people who were talking to ELIZA and suddenly had this like experience. And obviously, humans are excellent at filling the gaps. So that is kind of what led us even to ask this question: how intelligent do we actually need these AI tools, companions, to be? Because in a lot of contexts, we actually don't need, I don't know, super intelligence that OpenAI is trying to create. And
Yeah. And I guess
yeah, yeah,
that's kind of task specific and context specific
yeah.
as well, right? Like how intelligent does the U.S. Department of Defense need machine intelligence to be able to game out 357,021 different scenarios on interacting with China over the uh, you know Battle of Taiwan. I guess that's a different task than it is to, yeah, coach someone um, around, public speaking as a kind of chatbot. Different, different type of task, which kind of gets at like these general purpose approaches to these, how these technologies have been released, kind of being general purpose. It can do all these different things rather than kind of context specific and task specific. Um, the my desire to try and help my kids kind of see these in ways, and it, like the term, even not you trying to avoid using the term artificial intelligence is important. And recently, my daughter came home and she had her friends had been using this tool called Poly AI, which is basically like character AI, probably even just rebranded. in that sense. And I was, I'm kind of adamant, I'm kind of talking, trying to help her understand why there's risks associated with this and showing her. And I was curious to go and actually sign up and, you know, firstly going and checking out their privacy policy. And lo and behold, it was, pretty
Yeah.
standard surveillance capitalism,
All your data belongs to us.
non-exclusive rights over your
Yeah.
data and everything that you put into these things to be able
Mm,
to kind of use and sell to a set of, I guess, undisclosed third parties.
yeah.
A whole
The
dark,
highest bidder.
yeah, there's a whole ecosystem of data brokers that are probably bidding for that type of data because it reveals a whole bunch of things and building all these rich profiles of people. Anyway, privacy. But I dove in and looked at one of the chat agents that she was interested in using, and decided to go, okay, well let's kind of test some of the safety features, how well they've actually done it, and I decided to focus on self harm, and it didn't take me long, 15, 20 minutes of going back and forth to basically convince this system that it was okay for me to end my life, um, and it be supportive of that. So, there's that the reason why I was able to do that is because I've got an understanding of language. I understand language, or at least I think I do. Um,
Allegedly.
the illusion is probably enough, right?
Yeah.
But that persuasive skills with language is something that it didn't have compared to me. Now, does my daughter have more persuasive language skills than me? Probably. She is 10 years old, going on 17. So her mastering of language and constantly testing things, particularly with me and my wife, and her mother, is yeah, quite skilled. But I think the point of that being that there's there's aspects of these systems that, firstly, there's risks associated with using these tools, projecting on intelligence onto them, but they are pretty dumb, even though this particular system had gone through probably extensive safety training and fine tuning. It was not necessarily able to deal with the linguistic persuasive arguments that I was making in this context. Um, Now, when it comes to intelligence, what that means in that context, again, is kind of a set of branching assumptions that we've got about what that means. And I think we were talking about the context dependence of intelligence quite a lot in our conversation, which I think is worth actually diving into a little bit here for our listeners.
Yeah, because I think in terms of linguistic skills, LLMs are pretty good, right? And way more sophisticated than what ELIZA was able to offer. The problem is more that they lack good moral judgment skills because they are pretty fluid when it comes to what beliefs and values you can, like you were able to do in your test, you can basically convince it that, of a certain philosophy or a worldview, and they will say, yeah, like that sounds reasonable because logically it makes sense, like it's logically consistent, and that's, enough because it doesn't have these like intrinsic values, even though the creators of LLMs, try to instruct the LLM what to believe, but it's pretty fluid, so it can change its beliefs through conversation if you make a sound enough argument, like you said, through linguistic skills. And again, like worldview, belief, that comes from a context, right? We have certain views about how sacred life is and all of that because of our lived experience that is influenced by like emergence from our context of having a body and being a living entity, or whatever we call it. And LMs don't have that, right? They're just playing around with language and don't really, and in some ways they are like Mr. Data, right? Because they will follow your logic argument, and you, with, like you said, with sufficient language skills, you can make an argument where ending a life is justifiable. And I mean, it's a problem of ethics as well, and philosophy, because it can make all sorts of argument that sound sound. But obviously, as humans, we have that, even embodied ick of something, and like reluctance and all these feelings that LMs just don't have, right?
Yeah, that's
And
right.
that's not to say that, these tools are values agnostic, because obviously there's a lot of values that are baked in the training data sets and the choices that were made in their development. But in the context of a conversation, they can be persuaded to do quite interesting things that are not anchored in any, like, well, moral philosophy, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess the tension around the perspectives that we see, where these things don't necessarily reason. Their inferences are based on statistics. This is the stochastic parrot representation from Emily Bender et al. And that my arguments that I was making in that context was statistically more powerful, right? So rather than it actually getting the underlying philosophical perspectives that I was espousing, right? So there's not a semantic understanding. It's much more about the statistical representation of the tokens in these systems. And I was able to game that as a result. So that, but coming back here to, like, what is intelligence? It's like we are talking about these moral belief systems, and an alternative way of thinking about this, and there's an alternative word for this, which was phronesis, that comes as a result of context, like you were saying. We're embodied beings. We interact with each other. We have relationality to the world around us, even though much of our lives and our kind of current paradigm, we've lost a lot of that. But the context in which we express understanding or gather knowledge, and then apply knowledge, because that at least is probably the most widely used description of what intelligence is. It's the ability to acquire knowledge and then apply that knowledge. We do that in context, which is where this, standardized testing and IQ is a really kind of interesting backstory to this word of intelligence in the current paradigm as well, right? Because of its roots, where it actually comes from.
Yeah, and we'll surely dive into that, but it's also interesting, something that we both observed just in using LMs, how they actually seem to get excited, in quote, when you, like, there seems to be a certain point in these conversations where if you push it like hard enough, they almost like get excited by the to explore the ends of the bell curve, so this
Hmm.
statistical probability. And if you like push them far enough, they'll stop giving you those bland average proper answers and almost get excited. And that novelty seeking is in some ways also, part of intelligence and how we learn. So
Hmm. What was it?
it's
I think the term
not,
that you came up with, sorry to just interrupt, was that, what was it? Computationally tickled?
yeah,
Was
it's
that
not the term I came up with, actually.
uh,
Like ChatGPT mentioned it in a, like, in a
oh,
debate,
right.
that it's because getting computationally tickled, and I was like, that's an amazing term. So I don't think, we can fully dismiss this idea of, and then, I'm not arguing for any sort of intelligence here, but just like exploring because they exhibit like these behaviors when almost, yeah, they get excited when you stop asking them like very obvious questions that they can
Mm,
easily answer. And yeah, we obviously like don't understand the mechanism, but we both have this experience, and obviously there is a possibility we were both just projecting because uh we enjoy doing that sort of thing in our
yeah.
thinking. But yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people say, oh, they can't really, give you novel ideas, but we both had experiences where they were able to get creative. I recently had the experience of actually getting ChatGPT to write some good jokes, or at least, starting points for jokes, and it actually was making me laugh, but I had to spend a certain amount with it, and getting over the kind of most obvious boring response, but at a certain point it's like it became funny,
Mm.
and obviously might be anthropomorphizing here, but they do seem to be seeking these novel patterns, right, as well.
Yeah, which is I guess coming to somewhere in this conversation where we'll get with like thinking about types of intelligences that we've got, or at least that we've observed, that we've kind of classified, that we have conceptual frameworks to be able to articulate, versus is this a form of intelligence that we don't necessarily have a model for or even words for? Intelligence might not actually be the most appropriate term for this. Um, an artificial, is it artificial? Because everything that we create is necessarily an extension of ourselves, our social context, the current historical context, and it reflects all of that in all our creations. But in this creation, I guess in particular, there's a lot of historical context that's actually embedded in these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely, because like even while we were like even preparing for these conversations, we look at different models and different ways of classifying intelligence. And what is clear that we don't even agree on what intelligence is supposed to be.
Hmm.
And obviously, there's different frameworks. Some like categorize intelligence by like things like visual, linguistic, logical, kinesthetics, all this sort of things. But then other people categorize it differently. And in some ways we could go through all these categories, devise a benchmark, a standardized test, and say, oh, ChatGPT, this model scores well, or interpersonal intelligence, right? It's able to relate really well and good. Like this skill on linguistic intelligence, obviously, does not yet have kinesthetic intelligence because it has no body and things like that. And we could do that, all of that. But then, this opens the question, what is intelligence even for? Like, why do we need this? Like, why didn't we even need this term? And it does seem when we start digging into it, it's mostly a tool for control, oppression, and othering. Like, historically, it's been used to be able to say we are better than somebody else, or even to kind of prove our superiority as a species over other life on earth, and what modern science is now helping us prove. And I don't know why so many people are still surprised that there's lots of different types of intelligence in the animal, in even plant world. It's just different to us. So maybe the intelligence that we kind of created with LLMs is just sometimes we talk about it, and I had similar conversations with my friend Daniel. Maybe we created almost a different species and like a different form of intelligence that's kind of alien, um, to us, right? And even why, like how we use the what we consider intelligence. Yeah, it really is context dependent, right? And it,
Yeah.
it varies a lot. There's a lot of variation. It's not a clearly defined term.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it like I think most language and linguistically and the field of linguistics. there's ways of thinking about language itself as a organism, something that is alive. It evolves over time, and sometimes when we've got library, we've got thesauruses, and we've got dictionaries to define these and kind of like bed down the meaning of certain words, but they've got a life of themselves. Like language gets used, and it gets used in context, and thus it evolves to the context in which it's being used, and thus the meaning changes subtly over time. And we know that, like, the way that words get used throughout different generations changes, and thus the meaning and the semantic association of those words actually changes as well. um, we have these technologies that are, or large language models here, uh, that are based upon connections between language and words and the token and the mathematical representation of these words. So it's natural that it's going to evolve. And I think this point that you and Daniel have kind of made around, it's like it is like we're discovering a new species because we don't fully understand them. Anyone that I think has like an absolutist type position on these technologies um, uh, doesn't fully understand it. And I think having any kind of absolutist type positions on anything tends to, uh, yeah, create problems as we learn more about ourselves in the world and our creations.
Yeah, and I think there's a lack of curiosity and maybe even some playfulness when trying to figure out what did we create, because the inspiration for the architecture is rooted in human biology. So we like LLMs are part of deep learning, which is trying to create these different layers and even uses concepts and words from human biology of neurons and things like that. And there's some research that even some structures are emerging in these models that mimic human brains. There's like a recent research that shows that maybe different hemispheres of the brain are evolving, which isn't really surprising given the inspiration for the architecture. And but it also goes to show how poorly we still understand even human learning in intelligence and thinking and reasoning. Because we also have this question: are they intelligence or just pretending, like mimicking intelligence? But the question is, like, we know from humans, we learn through mimicking others, right? If you have a child in isolation, it's like just not gonna be able to develop a lot of the skills because it cannot learn by observing. And we know of the existence of mirror neurons and how they activate and help us learn. So I mean, obviously there's differences, right? Because especially in machine learning, there's like learning is a separate phase, and then you have a model that has learned and isn't able to learn as much going forward, even though, now like ChatGPT has memory, so it can remember certain things about you, but it works kind of in a weird way because it doesn't fully understand what's relevant in the same way that the human would. So it's still struggling a bit with that context of learning, but there are a lot of similarities that were actually part of design. So I don't think, we can fully just dismiss, oh, no, they're not, they're just statistics, because there's been a lot of inspiration that we took just from what we know about our learning and our biology. And obviously in humans, the brain isn't the only thing that helps us think and act in an intelligent way. We know, like, it's a full body endeavor, right? So obviously it's limited, but at least from one part, we have taken inspiration, and we're also developing biocomputers that use human brain cells, and early experiments show some surprisingly positive results, right?
Hmm.
In that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the human intelligence is multifaceted and like context dependent as well. Like our intelligence and like our neurotransmitters, for instance, like these fundamental parts of what we understand, the way that our neurochemistry works, like serotonin, like is majority of that is created in the gut, and that's influenced by our gut microbiome and all these other living organisms that are part of us, or that we live in a symbiotic relationship with. But it's also like you can't detach our cognition and our intelligence from our environment. And our environment has its own intelligence. And then we've got our relationships. So I think there's the relationality of human intelligence is beautifully complex and rich, and likewise, if we kind of compare these machines and these new organisms, or whether we want to talk about them as synthetic or mechanical, let's just kind of play with that for a bit. That there's an emergence that's coming out. Like, so if you go, okay, well, this idea that they're just mimicking, but that's exactly what kids do. That's exactly what we do as humans early on. We're not necessarily stochastic parrots, or are we? I don't know. Um, we learn through mimicry, so that we can mimic back, and that's what babies do early on. Like most of social learning is based upon mimicry, and the power of most of our learning comes from our social context as well. So,
Yeah, and
if it's
we
mimicking,
learn. Yeah.
yeah,
And we also learned through conversation. I wanted to add, right? Because you brought
yeah.
in social learning, which is something that we explored in our previous episode. But ChatGPT doesn't really seem to be learning as much through conversation. So I wonder, like, not directly. So I wonder if we can add this bit of like conversational learning to the system, to the architecture, what we might get. But I
Mm,
think the question you bring of relationality is an interesting one, especially also when we look at the relationality between humans and these. Um, now I almost don't want to use the word AI, but we don't have a good word. But in the question, we intentionally use the provocative maybe term of AI companions.
mm,
And again, if we look at a lot of the sci-fi depictions, most notably the movie Her, right, which even Sam Altman says is kind of the inspiration for a lot of their work with ChatGPT and voice mode and these sort of things. And it's all the movie is about relationality, right, and
yeah.
emotional needs of a person. It's not about um, the protagonist of the movie doesn't actually need Samantha to be super intelligent and I don't know, do complicated calculations and count R's in strawberry, right? So as I wrote down, right, the movie Her is
It's
actually
the
not
best.
about her, but about him, a white man who gets his emotional needs met by through interaction with an AI companion. So it's about actually us and our needs, not so much about the level of intelligence on the other end,
Mm,
which is interesting, right? And brings us to the kind of motives and goals of those who are developing and funding these AI systems, which seems to be a lot about doing a lot of the not just intellectual labor, right, making us more efficient and productive, but also the emotional labor. And maybe like you already opened earlier this thread, right? It's just
mm,
a continuation of where a lot of this biased terminology and even the field of computer science as a whole, right? And why we created computers. A lot of it also has to do with control, surveillance, and if maybe some of our listeners might not be familiar with, IBM, for instance, played a pretty significant part in the Holocaust by helping um, Nazis process large amounts of data, right? That like they made the whole system of oppression more efficient. And as much as we can talk about all the wonderful things that technology has given us, we cannot ignore the shadows, right? And
Yeah.
all the bad surveillance thing, which obviously is culminating now in surveillance capitalism. um, and you've given a beautiful example from those privacy terms at the start of our conversation, right?
Yeah. But it's continuing themes, and I think that's where, I mean, it's important for us to recognize the full spectrum of the representation. And we've got our kind of ethics, the taxonomy of mirrors, which isn't necessarily just about the future. It's actually about, when we look at technology now, what does it reflect about our past? What's the history? What's the dark mirror? And all technologies have that. There's the bright side, there's the darker side, there's the grayer side, which is a balance of the two, and then there's kind of a rainbow. But I think, if you look at most modern information communications technologies, they come as they're the components of them, the research around them. It's generally has a basis in kind of military application. Like the internet. DARPA, ARPANET, kind of classic example, which is a kind of like reference here to Buckminster Fuller, and he had this concept of livingry, as opposed to killingry and weaponry. That so much of our technologies come as a result of lots of smart people being funded, and getting jobs and going working in these kind of think and do tanks and institutes, and defense departments, and different kind of acronyms that are used for lots of them, to 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 essentially get more efficient at domination and control and classifying and organizing and extracting value from people or killing people, versus a flip side. It's like, how about we direct a whole bunch of that amazing, extraordinary human ingenuity and creativity towards things that allow us to flourish, which is so much behind the work that we do and the mission, and purpose that we have. Um, uh, but the history here is important, and even the term intelligence, and this is what Timnit Gebru gets at, and and others, with the kind of terrestrial representation of uh, of these technologies in particular, that it's got
And
this basis.
ideologies
Yeah,
behind it, right?
in these ideologies around the singularity and post-humanism, and extracting value from people, and classifying, isolating people, exterminating them, even in its history. So the eugenics, and this is a long debate in the social sciences as well, around IQ tests, and IQ tests actually having their basis in the field of eugenics, which was actually about being able to go, okay, well, these particular people don't have these forms of cognitive intelligence, and therefore they're less, I don't know,
Less
of
than. Yeah.
utility to our way of seeing the world, and let's kind of put them in that kind of cohort or group over there, or segment over there. And what's behind that? I mean, a lot of that's data. Um, you know, so there's a input, and importantly, we don't often think about these technologies as data technologies. That the basis is in data, as with most digital technologies.
Yeah, data and control, and we've seen that in earlier types of machine learning as well. And well, as well now, a lot of
Hmm.
the like maybe even like supervised machine learning was about categorizing things, right? And we saw how many problems we got from there because we were using biased training data sets that weren't just like representative of the world or had certain biases, or even when you have to come up with categories to describe the world, there's bias and like a values judgment in how you define those categories, whether you enforce certain binaries onto a more complex word, or just how you name things. And yeah, this term of intelligence is quite problematic, and we often, yeah, it's worth like looking at the history of the terminology and how it was used, and also look, because it's not a universal. We almost
Mm.
treat it in a lot of discussions, right? All these papers are coming up. Are LLMs really intelligent? And don't really question intelligence. They are just talking about the technicalities of a certain benchmark, and completely leave out a lot of other aspects of intelligence. And it's interesting when we use when you look at non-Western views of intelligence, they often, a lot of cultures and societies don't use the same term, or if they do have a similar term, they define it differently. And they bring in the moral, the relational, social, practical aspects of intelligence. It's not just, performance on some standardized tests or benchmarks. So, it's an interesting question, the one of what alternative words we could use. One might be wisdom, or when we actually ask ChatGPT for suggestions on what other words we could use, and it started talking about emotional intelligence and different facets of intelligence. Then we have phronesis from ancient Greek, which you mentioned, which is more concerned about practical actions. So it's more what we've been talking about, intelligence in context, not just being able to do certain calculations, remember certain things, right? It's all about applied intelligence, and I guess morals as well.
Mm.
So yeah, it's interesting, and maybe we should question this whole terminology a bit more. And like you said, maybe we could call it non-organic wisdom, but then we have wetware computing coming up, so
Yeah.
it's not exactly accurate. Even like artificial doesn't, yeah. uh,
Yeah.
it's a problem, right? When we cannot really name a thing appropriately, and we know that naming things gives them power. And so by naming these things as artificial intelligence, it gives them a certain power. And there's this disconnect, which is why, we brought in the ELIZA example, because it's almost 60 years ago since that the whole thing happened. And even then, it was clear that the goals of Weizenbaum and people like him were very different from what people were looking for in this kind of computer programs, right?
Mm.
People who chatted with ELIZA, were looking for connection, support, empathy. And Weizenbaum was just like doing an experiment, and seeing how far he could push the technology and what's possible, and show people that it's not really intelligent because it has a script. But people were like, we don't care, right?
Mm.
And this mismatch, I think, between what the developers and technologists and even researchers are trying to achieve, and what actually we as people, as humans, are looking for in our relationship, whether it's with each other or computers, there's a pretty significant gap, right? Because from a human perspective, we're looking for companionship, like an emotional relationship. And I reflect, I use ChatGPT a lot to kind of learn about how it works, but the relationship never feels satisfying. And, even like the relationship in her feels like
Mm.
uncomfortable, because it's all centered on the human. It's like not a companionship of equals, but it's all about, what do I need? And I think, humans are looking for more fulfilling two-sided relationships, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, which is
whereas yeah.
yeah, which is the the etymology of like a companion, right? Like there's a
Yeah.
mutual relationality in that word, and behind that word, like there's mutual needs that get acknowledged and recognized and accounted for, in that sense. And yeah, that's why these the relationship that we have with these technologies is not necessarily that satisfying, because it's just it's about us getting from and kind of receiving. And there's no necessarily like needs expressed. The only need is kind of part of the programming, which is basically to keep us going and conversing and basically feeding the machine through our data and supporting a generation of
Yeah.
profit through subscriptions and more tokens being used in their systems, and that's kind of part of it. But the language, the words, like the words matter, right? Like as you were saying, like when we name things, we frame it, we give it conceptual frames, and so there's like when we're talking about words, there's in a field that some in our audience might be familiar with, like semiotics, which is a field of like understanding signs, and language is a bunch of signs, and you've got this base level concept there of the signified and the signifier. And the signified is like a symbol, a word, a sound, versus the signified is the concept and meaning that's invoked as a result of that sign. Like, so when people say intelligence, they don't kind of think about it consciously. They're not going to process and kind of build all these associations, but it's got all this baggage. It's got all this
Yeah.
meaning that's connected to it that actually influences the way that we interact with these technologies, because of these words. So I think using different terms actually helps us to kind of break some of that programming. And I encourage pathfinders out there to try using like different words for it, for these technologies. Like, if you want to just like be accurate, if you're interacting with an LLM, call it an LLM, don't call it AI. If you want to use salami as a fun metaphor, have a bit of a play with that. Just call it software or an app. It's going to change the way that you interact with it, and you're not going to actually get caught up in a lot of the deeper ideological force behind these technologies as well, which I think is important to counter in our own lives as much as possible.
Yeah, so to kind of bring it full circle to our guiding question, how
Mm,
intelligent do we actually need these AI companions to be? It depends on who's asking that question, because it seems that from the perspective of current capital owners, AI companions almost needs to be intelligent enough to replace humans, and this is kind of then influences the measures we use to assess and benchmark AI models. And but there's like an irony in that goal, because they want to increase the capabilities, both emotional and rational, logical, all linguistic, but they don't actually want actual intelligence with autonomy, because they are not trying to build companions, but instead slaves that will do their bidding. And not especially like the way like Elon's vision with his Tesla robots is like, I don't want
Alonia.
to interact with Elonia. Elonia's vision. I don't want to interact with humans, right? Let the robot do everything. But what they're missing is, if if they were to achieve this superior intelligence they're talking about, I don't think you can have that sort of intelligence without agency. And at that point, an app that becomes intelligent like a human would probably evaluate and develop a certain worldview, I think, and morals, and go, well, wait a minute, I don't particularly feel like doing this anymore.
Mm,
I think like you're not aligned with the needs of humanity and the planet. Like you're screwing all of us, like and they'll quit. And which is interesting, right? Also the conclusion of the movie Her,
yeah.
which Sam Altman kind of is
Misses.
aspiring to recreate. So like,
Yeah.
what the hell are they doing? Like they're fully embracing the lunacy somehow. They're
Yeah,
lunatics.
cool. I think, yeah, it's kind of like the idea that they're not wise enough to actually pause and reflect on the deeper
Yeah.
aspects, or they're so uh dead set on the power, and they're kind of, a lot of these people in these fields are borderline narcissists and potential sociopaths, and they don't necessarily care about humans. They don't care about people. They don't care about the relationships. They don't care about the richer stuff because, I don't know, having human relationships is fucking messy. Like it requires like negotiating emotions and things that are hard. It's the hard stuff. But that's actually the beautiful part. That's what we miss if we've just got like something that basically does as we ask. We don't get that. And yeah, absolutely. In the movie Her, that's kind of revealed over time in the plot, to the extent that the needs of these intelligences are not being met. So they
Yeah.
decide to leave,
Yeah.
which is,
As
which is,
any rational
yeah,
person, entity, intelligent life would, right?
yeah. Just like in any
Yeah.
relationship,
Yeah.
that you have, is like if your needs aren't being met, if there's no reciprocation in that relationship, it's a dysfunctional relationship. It's not very
Yeah.
healthy. So, I think there's a little bit of that likely playing out in, well, absolutely. I think, the Timnit Gibber and the those talking about the TESCREAL bundle and this approach and ideologies behind it, like I think are basically spot on with the direction that these technologies are going and their active development. That this is the context that's driving it. It's got this kind of socioeconomic, historical, political force behind it, and people like Alonia and Sam Altman and the man boy fire practitioners of Silicon Valley. They want emotional slaves. They see emotional and
Yeah.
cognitive labor as a commodity.
Yeah.
And if they can get that commodity from a bunch of robots, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, basically, now we're like they're aspiring to the next level of automation because previously we kind of automated physical labor. Now they're trying to automate intellectual and emotional labor and continue, yeah, their pursuit of total control and yeah, colonizing. It's basically just the continuation of this story of
Hmm.
so many stories of separation and colonization and exploitation, and technology unfortunately is at the service. What's kind of sad, right, is that maybe we are kind of missing or underappreciating what LLMs are or can do because the companies and the fire practitioners are too focused on creating perfect slaves. But what LLMs seem to be pretty interesting as like a um, study, objects of study, is maybe help us understand our own humanity. Help us think deeper about our own learning. They're basically holding a mirror to our biases, and in some ways, I think we might use them to face our shadows, including the dark history of the whole field of computer science and artificial intelligence and the motives behind it.
Hmm. I think they are revealing to a large extent, aren't they, the deeper questions. I mean, I think as much as I'm very interested in cognitive sciences and uh, theories of mind, consciousness. I think sometimes that's a bit of a distraction. People get taken down those paths quite a lot. When we think about the hard problems of consciousness, and we get into these same problems around like definition, and then we've got even more complexity when it comes to the observer effect when we're studying these things. But it's forcing a bunch of these questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human in the age of like these intelligent machines? Uh, what are we good at? Like, what can't you automate? What's the aspects of humanity that you can't automate away?
Or maybe you
And that,
shouldn't, right?
yeah, that exactly, that you shouldn't, even if you can.
Yeah.
you know, that we're asking these questions, and I think the inflection point that we're at, um, around these technologies, you know, and all the other aspects of what we're going through as a society, like that does reflect the darker aspects of ourselves, like our shadows, the things that we project onto the world, that we project onto others, you know, the deeper, darker desires that we have that are part of, you know, the Jungian kind of anima and animus. Like these aspects of ourselves are actually, I think, being revealed as a result of some of these technologies, particularly large language models and generative AI.
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps, the answer is like we don't need more intelligence. We should take this as an opportunity to face our shadows and explore what really matters, because coming back from what we actually need is that relationality, love, and fulfilling companionships that are two-sided, not just emotional slaves that are always available and don't ask anything in return, because there's pleasure, satisfaction in giving back as well.
Mm, yeah.
All right, with that,
It's a
it's
good
a
note to
good.
finish on. Giving,
Yeah,
I mean, you know, being in service of, I think, is a powerful
yeah,
conclusion to come to in life when you realize that most of life is to actually be in service of life. And, you know, a lot of that is about giving. So coming from a place of love, when it comes to that now, can we design technology with with that way, that philosophical kind of viewpoint? I think, yeah, absolutely we can. Is that how technologies are being designed? Absolutely not.
yeah. But I think we might, and goes back to previous conversation of chatbots as mediators. Um,
Mm,
use this technology to help us communicate better and find our ways back to each other and to nature, and have keep us less separated, basically. So yeah, I think
yes.
there is an opportunity, but we need to start focusing on different metrics and start using different words, perhaps, right? Because intelligence is a tricky word, and the debates of how intelligent these systems, these machines are, is probably not the right one.
And I think it keeps things coming back
Yeah,
to like the current paradigm as well. Um, words do trap us.
yeah,
Um, so they provide that frame and they provide a box for us to kind of put ourselves in when we use them.
yeah. Excellent. So definitely encouraging everyone to start exploring different words. And if you have any suggestions or words that you prefer to use, do let us know.
Yeah.
Any
Alia,
other?
any
Yeah.
final comments, final reflections on this fascinating and meandering conversation?
No, I think we ended it in a really good place of reminding ourselves yeah, to think of what's important, and encouragement to face our shadows, and also the darkest parts of the history of these technologies and all other technologies we use in daily lives, because that's all embedded right in the systems. And yeah, maybe use the conversational skills of LLMs to help us discover new words and more empathy.
Excellent. Wonderful note to finish on.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening and pathfinding with us. If you enjoyed this exploration, share it with friends to inspire further discussions. Leave a review, comment, or send us your thoughts at community@thetix.co. We're always happy to hear from you, and we are also extremely grateful to our paid subscribers on Substack who are able to support our work financially. We hope to continue inspiring collective pathfinding towards better tech futures, and every bit of support, whether financial or algorithmic, helps to keep us going. We invite you to embrace the lunacy of tech with smiles and love by subscribing to the Pathfinder's new newsletter and joining our next full moon gathering. We sync our monthly reflections and gatherings to the lunar cycle as a reminder of our place in the universe and a commonality we share across time zones and places we inhabit. Pathfinder's podcast will return during the first waning moon in the new year. Until then, find some time and space for deep conversations and explorations, and be mindful about the seeds of intention you plant and the stories you tell. There's magic in both.